How do you think about yourself? That sounds like a simple question, but it can have an enormous effect on how you feel and how you behave. Two approaches to psychotherapy, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, or REBT, and Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT, both pay close attention to our sense of self, but they approach the self in somewhat different ways. Let's look at those differences, and then at some of the interventions each approach uses. First, consider a simple statement. I failed an exam. That is a description of something that happened, but a person might take that observation and turn it into, I failed, therefore I am a failure. Something important just happened. We went from evaluating an event or a performance to evaluating an entire human being, the REBT approach. REBT is particularly concerned with this kind of global self-rating. From an REBT perspective, there is nothing wrong with evaluating what we do. I can say I performed poorly. I can decide that I don't like something I did. I can acknowledge a weakness and work to improve it. The problem occurs when I take one behavior, characteristic, achievement, failure, or even a collection of them, and use those things to assign a global rating to myself. I failed, so I am a failure. I acted badly, so I am a bad person. People rejected me, so I must be unlikable. I succeeded, so now I am a worthwhile person. Interestingly, REBT is concerned about both negative and positive global self-ratings. Why? Because if my worth depends on succeeding today, what happens when I fail tomorrow? Instead of trying to build higher self-esteem, REBT traditionally emphasizes unconditional self-acceptance, often abbreviated USA. The basic idea is this: I can evaluate my behavior without globally evaluating myself. I am a complex, changing, fallible human being. Some things I do are helpful, some are unhelpful. I have strengths and weaknesses. I succeed at some things and fail at others. None of those individual characteristics can logically define my entire worth as a person. REBT, intervention, disputing self-ratings. One way REBT works with this is through disputation. Suppose someone says, I made a terrible mistake at work, so I'm incompetent. An REBT therapist might ask, what evidence shows that making this mistake makes you completely incompetent? That is an empirical question. Or the therapist might ask, how does it logically follow that because you performed poorly in this situation, your entire self can be rated as incompetent? That is a logical question. And we can also ask, what happens when you keep telling yourself that you are incompetent? Does that belief actually help you learn from the mistake and improve? That is a pragmatic question. REBT does not try to convince the person to replace I am incompetent with I am wonderful. That would still involve global self-rating. Instead, we might arrive at I perform poorly in this situation. I don't like that, and I want to improve. But one or more performances do not define me as a human being. Separating the part from the whole. Another REBT intervention is to demonstrate the problem of rating an entire person based on individual characteristics. Imagine trying to give yourself one final score as a human being. What would you include? Your intelligence, your relationships, your appearance, your kindness, your mistakes, your accomplishments? And how much would each count? The exercise quickly exposes the difficulty of turning an enormously complex, constantly changing human being into a single global rating. REBT encourages us to rate our behaviors when it's useful, while giving up the attempt to rate the entire self. Behavioral risk-taking. REBT also uses behavioral interventions. One classic example is the shame-attacking exercise. A person intentionally does something harmless but potentially embarrassing, such as wearing mismatched clothing or asking an intentionally unusual question. The specific exercise should be safe, legal, and respectful of other people. The purpose isn't simply to embarrass yourself. It is to practice experiencing possible disapproval without turning that disapproval into a judgment about your worth. Someone might think, people may think what I did was foolish. They may even dislike it. I would prefer their approval, but I don't need it to accept myself. That moves unconditional self-acceptance from an intellectual idea into an experience. Cost-benefit analysis. REBT can also examine the costs and benefits of self-rating itself. At first, high self-esteem sounds entirely positive. But suppose my self-esteem depends on being successful, intelligent, attractive, productive, or well-liked. Now I have something I constantly have to protect. Failure doesn't simply mean that something went badly, it threatens my worth. REBT asks whether we might function better by giving up this global rating system altogether. The ACT approach, acceptance and commitment therapy, approaches the problem differently. A CT is generally less interested in debating whether a self-description is true or false. Instead, it asks what happens when we become fused with a particular story about ourselves. I am weak. I am broken. I am a failure. I am the successful one. I am the person everyone depends upon. Even positive identities can become restrictive when we become rigidly attached to them. ACT distinguishes between different ways of experiencing the self, including what is often called the conceptualized self and self-as-Context. The conceptualized self consists of the stories, descriptions, roles, memories, and labels we have accumulated about ourselves. Self-as-Context refers to the perspective from which we can notice all of those experiences without being reduced to any one of them. Instead of trying to determine whether a self-story is the correct description of me, ACT helps me notice that it is a story my mind is producing. ACT intervention, cognitive diffusion. One of the best-known ACT interventions is cognitive diffusion. Suppose I have the thought, I am incompetent. Instead of arguing with the thought, I might say, I am having the thought that I am incompetent, and I can take another step. I notice that I am having the thought that I am incompetent. The thought hasn't necessarily disappeared. We haven't even tried to prove that it is false. What has changed is my relationship to it. I am incompetent sounds like a fact about reality. I notice that I am having the thought that I am incompetent identifies it as a mental event that I can observe. That little bit of psychological distance can make an enormous difference. The chessboard metaphor. A CT also makes extensive use of experiential metaphors. One example is the chessboard. Imagine your thoughts, feelings, memories, and bodily sensations as pieces on a chessboard. Some pieces seem positive, others seem negative. We can spend enormous amounts of energy trying to make the good pieces defeat the bad pieces. But ACT invites us to consider another possibility. What if you are not one of the pieces? What if you are more like the board? The board can contain all the pieces without becoming any particular piece. In the same way, we can experience fear, sadness, self-criticism, confidence, joy, or doubt without any single experience completely defining who we are. The sky and the weather. Another metaphor uses the sky and the weather. Thoughts and emotions can be viewed as weather. Some days bring sunshine, others bring clouds, thunderstorms, or heavy rain. But the sky is not the weather. In the same way, ACT encourages us to notice that the content of our experience changes while the perspective from which we notice those experiences remains available. A thought such as, I am broken, can therefore be noticed rather than obeyed. Mindfulness and observing. ACT also uses mindfulness exercises to help people notice self-evaluations as they occur. A thought appears, I'm weak. Instead of fighting with it, suppressing it, or automatically accepting it as true, I can observe it. There is the thought again. I can allow it to be present without letting it determine what I do next. And this leads to another central part of ACT, values and committed action. The ultimate goal isn't merely to become a better observer of thoughts. It is to create greater psychological flexibility so that thoughts and feelings do not prevent us from moving toward the things we value. So, what is the difference? REBT and ACT overlap in an important way. Both can help us loosen rigid identification with judgments about ourselves, but they often get there through different routes. REBT asks us to examine the belief, I failed, therefore I am a failure. It may challenge the evidence, the logic, and the usefulness of that conclusion. Then it moves toward unconditional self-acceptance. I failed at something. That doesn't turn my entire self into a failure. A CT might respond to the same thought differently. Instead of disputing, I am a failure, ACT may help the person notice, my mind is giving me the I am a failure story again. The person can make room for that thought without allowing it to define the self or dictate behavior. So in simplified terms, REBT helps us stop globally rating ourselves and instead practice unconditional self-acceptance. A CT helps us step back from our self-stories and experience the self as the context in which those stories occur. And both approaches ultimately point towards something beyond endless self-evaluation. The question becomes less, what does this prove about me? And more, what do I want to do now? In REBT, we can evaluate whether our beliefs and behaviors help us pursue our goals. In ACT, we can choose actions that move us toward our values, even when difficult thoughts and feelings are present. Different theories, different clinical mechanisms, but both offer ways of becoming less controlled by rigid stories about who we supposedly are and more able to get on with the business of living. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not psychotherapy and is not a substitute for psychological, psychiatric, medical, legal, or other professional care. If you are experiencing significant psychological distress or mental health concerns, consider consulting an appropriately qualified professional.